The post office scandal, strikes and net zero. The stories dominating the start of an election year. This is the first Politics Live of 2024. Joining me, Conservative MP Paul Scully, Labour peer and former General Secretary of the TUC, Francis O'Grady, the political editor of The Mirror, John Stevens, and Telegraph Associate Editor Camilla Tominey. On today's programme,
we have made progress. And at the start of this year, we are heading in the right direction.
Both main party leaders meet voters on the first day of term here in Westminster. Could this be a general election year?
Post Office Limited is stealing my livelihood, my shop, my job, my home, my life savings, my good name.
Are politicians matching the scale of national outrage about the treatment of postmasters? Doctors are still on the picket line today, but strikes are off on the London Underground. Did the Mayor of London cave in to striking workers, or was he being constructive?
I will not be voting for this bill. It is actually a smoke and mirrors bill, which frankly changes nothing.
And is drilling in the North Sea compatible with combating climate change? Let's start with Westminster's favourite parlour game, and that is the date of the next general election, because over the recess period, over Christmas and New Year, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, said his working assumption was an election in the autumn. But my opening question to our guests here today on the first programme of Politics Live for 2024 is, what's the election going to be fought on, Camilla?
Well, I suppose you could say the economy's stupid, kind of quoting the Clinton aide. I think also immigration's going to be a large feature of the election, not least with Reform champing at the bit to try and steal Tory voters. I think the timing is quite interesting because I think Isaac Levidow, to be fair, had been saying to most people at conference last autumn that it was going to be in the second half of 2024.
And he's the sort of campaign organiser at the Tory
But
headquarters.
actually, to not go in the spring does show a lack of confidence, doesn't it, by the government? Because there is an argument for saying you could come out with a punchy March budget with quite a few retail offerings for the public and then go to the polls immediately after that, hoping to secure support rather than waiting for another summer of small boat landings, getting into November where it's cold, people are perhaps less likely to go out to the polling booth. So it does demonstrate a bit of a lack of confidence in their own electoral strategy, I think.
Do you agree with that, John?
Yeah, I think there's still a possibility that we could end up
going
having
in
an election
May?
in May, because, it's my working assumption we're going to have an election in the second half of the year. That's a very carefully worded way of denying that you're going to have an election anytime soon. I think that if you did have the budget in March, we've heard the government, we've heard Jeremy Hunt, we've heard Rishi Sunak saying they're going to announce more tax cuts in that. I think if you did have that sort of budget, you did suddenly start to see the polls begin to move, then I think the government might think, well, why not just go for it? And we've been talking over the last few months about how the government might cling on and see if something comes up. Well, something could come up in a good way. It can also come up in a bad way. We've seen that with the post office row over Christmas. We've seen that with flooding over the last couple of weeks. There is the possibility that something does come up in the next few weeks, whether it's another RAC scandal that could completely blow the Tories off course.
But do you think it will be fought on the economy then, if they've left themselves room, the government, by going for an early budget in March and also heralding this 2 percentage point cut in national insurance? Is it going to be on the economy rather than immigration?
I think the Tories would like it to be on their reputation of cutting taxes, but I think that people can remember what's happened over the last few years. They remember what was in the Tory manifesto that Paul and his colleagues stood on when you said that you weren't going to raise national insurance, income tax or VAT. And then a couple of years into that, when Rishi Sunak, the man who is Prime Minister, was Chancellor, he decided to rip that up and put national insurance up to its highest ever level. And Paul and his colleagues voted for that.
Paul?
Look, first of all, I think the working assumption phrase is fine because actually it means he's aiming at autumn, but it gives them the wriggle room to go for the spring if something changes. If it was an immigration election, I can see Camilla's point, but I think it's more going to be about the economy, people's mortgage rates, so therefore it allows people time to fix it. But in terms of the national insurance, you know, what we hadn't accounted for in that 2019 manifesto is having to push £408 billion worth of COVID support out to businesses and jobs and livelihoods over that period of time. You've got to get that money back from somewhere. So it's been incredibly difficult, challenging the last few years.
But it's the mixed messaging, isn't it? Saying that you are cutting taxes when the overall tax burden is still rising.
I think it's the single biggest tax cut, the individual tax cut, rather than the overall budget. Yeah.
What's it going to be fought on? Is it going to be on the economy? Would you like it to be on the economy?
I think most people are going to judge it on, do I feel better off? And I think most people don't. You know, we've had the longest squeeze on living standards on record and people are still really struggling. I think Rishi Sunak has got a problem if he keeps spinning it out, this date, because I think most people want him to get on with it. They want a May election, or certainly by the summer. And also, he's got these 5 factions in the Tory party, the 5 families, each with their own Don, who are going to be at each other's throats. The Tory party, I think, to be fair to Rishi Sunak, has become ungovernable, and that will become more and more evident to the public at large.
Right, well...
Just one other point is, I think the interim report of the COVID public inquiry is going to come out in the summer, and we're going to be reminded about how austerity left us so poorly prepared for the pandemic, what happened with PPE, what happened on those COVID contracts with VIP lanes, and generally, you know, the people who were described as heroes are now being demonised.
All right.
I think that's going to be a really difficult
a big issue for them to deal with. Well, you mentioned the 5 families, as you described them, within the Conservative Party. Let's have a look at this headline in The Guardian, one of them from the New Conservatives. Conservatives face obliteration as UK in worse state than 2010, says Danny Kruger, and says the Conservative Party would leave the country sadder, less united and less conservative than they had found it. What do you make of that?
I think what he was doing, he was giving a stark warning to people. He said it in his way. Others, David Davis, Liam Fox have said similar, not similar things, but have given stark warnings to the party to say, you know, we've got to unite, we've got to fight as a team. You talked about the 5 families. If you want to carry on the Godfather references, you've got to go to the mattresses. You've got to actually prepare for what's coming in terms of a very intense, long, protracted election campaign here, remembering that the political enemy for us is the Labour Party. That's the alternative for us. So we've got to come and unite and actually set out a vision. This is the important thing. It's not good enough just to say, stick to the plan. We've got to get to our next stage and say, and this is what's coming afterwards. This is 5 years of hope, of vision, of aspiration.
Well, as you mentioned, I think, John, you never know what's coming round the corner, and the Post Office scandal certainly erupted again over Christmas because anyone who watched that ITV drama in the last few days on the battle by postmasters and mistresses to clear their names, having been wrongly accused of theft and or false accounting, couldn't fail to have been moved by the injustice of the situation. And it seems to have prompted the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, meeting the minister responsible for the Post Office as the government looks at ways of helping hundreds of wrongly convicted sub-postmasters. Now, it's been described as the UK's most widespread miscarriage of justice. Here's the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, earlier today. Let's have a listen.
The Justice Secretary today is meeting with the relevant ministers to see is there more we can do to speed up some of those processes. But people should be rest assured the money is there. I approved it as Chancellor. There are 3 different compensation schemes, and we will do everything we can to make this right for all the people affected, because it's simply wrong what happened. They shouldn't have been treated like this, and we should do everything we can to make it right for them.
I mean, is that it, Paul? I mean, we're talking about hundreds of people's lives that have been ruined wrongly, it seems, and we have one minister meeting another. Do you think that fully reflects the public outrage over this situation?
I think that is just for one particular stage. That is a fact, is there's only something like 70-odd people that have had their convictions quashed. What we need to do is get all of them through that process. But you have to, at the moment, do it one at a time, which is ridiculous. So that's what the meeting is there about. But as the Prime Minister said, because I set up the compensation schemes. It was me that went to him.
Because you were the minister responsible.
When Rishi was Chancellor, to ask him for the money. And you had to go through this arcane process when you literally had to do a value for money exercise. And crikey, as you rightly say, this is people's lives. There are people who have died, there are people who commit suicide, there are people being chased out of their villages and indeed left the country as a result of this. Of course it's value for money. Of course we've got to get on and do this.
Right. Well, why isn't the government doing it? I mean, they could. I mean, I don't know if people realise that, you know, the government is the only shareholder of the post office.
Yeah.
I mean, this idea that we should keep it at arm's length in the way the government is trying to say is for the birds.
What I've said over the last week or so, if I had my time again, I would have pulled it all into government and run the compensation schemes ourselves. I think the post office, the management that is in now, the chief exec, I think he was willing to do stuff, but I think he was quite overwhelmed and didn't realise the scale, I think. That was my sense. And so they've had a lot of catching up to do. But the Postal Affairs Minister says he wants to get the compensation done by August this year.
Right, does he get it, Rishi Sunak?
I think he probably gets it now, but you could argue it's too little, too late.
It's gone on for
I mean,
decades,
to be
this.
fair, the press has been covering this. It was first broken by Computer Weekly, right? So what's most interesting, I think, when you look at the Sunday Times piece yesterday about Mr Bates's correspondent with Sir Ed Davey, and to be fair, people have said Sir Ed Davey has questions to answer. He was in charge of postal services as minister under the coalition. He's now obviously Liberal Democrat leader, but there are probably very many people with questions to answer. But Mr Bates's correspondence with Davey is almost a lesson in what it's like to be a little person dealing with officialdom these days. So he says, you know, there's something catastrophic is going wrong with this Horizon system. We really need some help. We really need to have a meeting. And he's greeted with this sort of, pardon the phrase, but computer says, no, this isn't our problem. We want to pass the buck. I appreciate Mr Davey has now said, hindsight, I would handle things differently.
He said the post office executives didn't come clean with him, and there were definitely attempts to stop me meeting campaigners.
I know, but everybody can sympathise with that situation Mr Bates finds himself in, where he's banging his head against.
I did exactly the opposite. I actually asked Lord Arbuthnot for Alan Bates's telephone
this is
number
the Tory
and phoned
MP.
him up, because fast forwarding a decade later. But it's a lesson of how you should deal with government.
But the other thing is, which has really angered the public, and that's why we've seen these million signatures, is what's happened in the case of Paula Venables.
Now, Paula Venables is the former CEO of the Post Office.
Is that you look at this situation and you see an organisation that has washed its hands of a catastrophic scandal involving its own people. She got that CBE for services to the post office.
Yeah,
well, I'm sorry. Why has she... It's the likes of Mr Bates who should be the one with the honour, and the likes of Paula Venables. I can't understand why this lady is still holding on to this CBE. Just give it up. It was a catastrophic error. You're vicariously responsible for it.
John, and then I'll play you the clip.
You'd think she would want to say... I mean, she said before that mistakes were made. You would just think... Her name now is very damaged, as Paula Venables, as a person's damaged. You just think, ditch the CBE and get the debate to move on and get people to start talking about what can the government do now. We can talk about what did Ed Davey do wrong many years ago, but as Paul said, I think it's about 93 of the almost 900 people who were convicted have had their convictions overturned. The government could do something now to sort it out.
And quash all of the convictions in one go?
Lord Faulkner was on Radio 5 Live this morning, and he said if the government wanted to do it tomorrow, they could introduce an Act of Parliament and get on with it. Well, that's what people want ministers to do now.
And hopefully that's what it'll be coming to Parliament later on. That's exactly what I'm going to be asking.
Just before
later on's too far.
No, I mean this afternoon.
Right.
Right, well, but just before I come to you, Francis, let's play, because Camilla mentioned the CBE that was awarded to the former Post Office Chief Executive Paula Venables, and there is a petition, 1 million strong signatures calling for her to be stripped of that CBE. But let's have a look at the moment in the ITV drama when Alan Bates, the campaigner, discovers that she's received a CBE.
All the meetings with MPs, letters to the minister, more ministers than you could shake a stick at. Years and years. Still nobody in power hears a word we say.
What's brought this on?
Your ears honors list.
God's sake, come on, turn it off. Details, man, come to bed.
Paula Venables has got the CBE.
Joking.
Services to the post office.
Should she, Paula Venables, be stripped of that CBE?
I think the CBE is one thing. I think seeing a few people in the dock would be more compensation for people who've suffered massive injustice over years and years and years. And let's be clear, this isn't the only time. It seems whenever the so-called, as Mr. Bates called it, the little people are looking for justice, it takes years, whether it's Hillsborough, Grenfell, Orgreave, Shrewsbury, whenever it's ordinary working people trying to get justice.
How do you change
nobody
that, though, Frances?
listens.
How do you change that?
Well, really practical issues like how you get access to justice in this country. That was a big issue for the Postmasters campaign, about how can you even afford to get your voice heard.
But this wasn't just this government, these are subsequent, the coalition government, probably actually going back to the Labour governments before. Why?
And also Fujitsu,
the company who
ran
designed Horizon,
that
the
contract,
IT system.
they've had £7 billion worth of government contracts over the last decade. And it just reminds me of P&O, you know, when 800 seafarers got sacked over Zoom, and the owner of their company, DP World, was not stripped of its contracts. Nobody got prosecuted, nobody got sanctioned, nobody got fined.
So if Labour wins the election at whatever point this year, would you like to see those contracts looked at again or taken away from Fujitsu?
Certainly they shouldn't be getting new contracts, which is what's happened. You know, I understand the legal constraints on existing contracts, but why on earth are we handing out public money to people who have, you know, destroyed lives? It seems wrong.
I mean, the Post Office could also be stripped, I suppose, of its powers to prosecute individuals itself. That was one of the other striking parts of the ITV drama and the panorama and the press coverage before, is that they are one of quite a number of organisations, sort of government bodies, if you like, that can prosecute people themselves. Should they still be able to do that?
No, Post Office, that ability actually predates government, full stop. I mean, I think they've had that power since Henry VIII. It's literally, you know, an incredibly long time. Nick Wallace well,
they certainly used it to...
But no, they shouldn't have. They've not prosecuted anyone, I think, since 2015, but they shouldn't be able to do so. For the reasons that you've just seen. I think in Fujitsu's case, my understanding is that they've been taken off the frameworks, but they've still been able to bid into individually for contracts. But I have, you know, a lot of sympathy that if you've done such an egregious act, in terms of recompense and where we go with that, I think we probably need to get to the end of the statutory inquiry, so we've got all the information to hand, and then that's when we can really...
Although it's certainly a lesson as well in this emphasis behind believing the technology and not the human.
Yeah,
totally.
And how will lessons be learned from that?
The bosses, not the workers, because when ministers say they were misled by the bosses, well, surely to goodness you should listen to what the workers are saying too. At least, you know, give equal time to what those...
We've got to be human first, politician second in any of this kind of thing. When it's clear that there are hundreds of people affected by this, in the early days, the Post Office was telling everybody it's just you.
Yes, you're the only one.
But when you've got 700 people,
and the government promised compensation would be sorted by Christmas, and it hasn't been.
What are you going to do? You are in the process of telling us what you're going to do and say this afternoon.
Yeah, I think well, first of all, I think we need to look at making sure that Kevin Hollinrake said by August, he's the Postal Affairs Minister now, he said he wants the compensation to be finished by August this year. There are 3 strands. So there are people that have just lost out financially, just in inverted commas, obviously. Yeah. People that have been convicted that need to be have their convictions overturned. And of course, Alan Bates and the 555 people in the court case that was in the series, because they've already had what was termed full and final settlement. We've had to go back in and reopen that because clearly they get next to none of the money because it all went on legal fees, which is totally... So they've been penalised more so than anybody else.
And the government should just foot that bill for everyone's... Yeah. And they should just do that. And what is the amount... Do you know the amount of money that we're talking about?
No, I mean, it will run to several hundreds of millions of pounds. But you know, effectively, if you put that... Because if you put that onto the Post Office, the Post Office, obviously, we are asking the Post Office still to run an economic model and a business with social value as well. So taxpayer has to step in. But there again, should the taxpayer be the only organisation or people to do that? No, you're looking at Fujitsu, you're looking at the Post Office and other individuals.
The irony being that Mr Bates had initially claimed £36,000 and this is going to turn out to cost about $2 billion in total or something astronomical. The other thing is there's a lady on the radio today on Nick Ferrari's show who was actually acquitted, but she was dragged through the courts for 3.5 days. She left the court, somebody spat at her. She then had
But it's
to
about people's reputations.
She then had to get
Their
married,
names.
like undercover. She had to move 20 miles away from her own hometown because she was known as the post office lady.
Do you think this will change things beyond the post office scandal and whatever is decided on the back of ministers meeting about compensation and quashing or overturning these wrongful convictions? Will it change anything fundamentally about, you mentioned Hillsborough and other massive public inquiries that just take forever?
Well, I think clearly in this case something is going to have to change, not just because it's the right thing, but also, as you said at the top of the programme, we're in an election year. This is an issue that has caught the public's imagination rightly, and they are going to want to see action. Whether you start to see wider change, maybe more people will be alert to these things in the future. I mean, in the case of the post office, clearly Paula Venables didn't mean to do any of this deliberately, but you had a situation where suddenly hundreds of sub-postmasters had their hands in the till if you were listening to the post office. So clearly there was a problem here that clearly they didn't really have their hands in the till, which proved to be the case. Or there was some massive recruitment problem that suddenly the post office, instead of having upstanding members of the community doing all these roles, were suddenly recruiting a load of thieves. So somewhere, it should have occurred to someone that there was a problem
Groupthink
here.
and brand protection, isn't it? Rather than actually, as I say, being human.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why I think unions are pushing for new rights with new technology, particularly artificial intelligence, that we should have the right to a human review of decisions, because things do go wrong. The technology, isn't perfect. Things can go wrong.
And people don't want to admit mistakes. It
Well,
seems...
as we saw, there was an awful lot of people defending themselves rather than doing the right thing.
But when you were the minister responsible for the post office, did you really know the scale of it as it's turned out to be? You probably did. It was 2020 to 2022.
Yeah, the court case had already
Did you feel you had
already
the
happened.
Did you feel you had the power to act? Did you feel you had, I know you were part of the government, but senior minister's ear over this?
Yeah, I think the one great thing about that role, because I was also looking after hospitality, retail, small business during COVID and British Business Bank. So it was one of those roles that actually normally you don't need that much attention on the Post Office and Royal Mail, but suddenly it came to the fore and I was left to do what I needed to do, which is great. But then I could lean in on it. But what I found was, as I say, having picked up the phone to Alan Bates to start to work on the compensation, having been pushed, look, this is full and final settlement, we shouldn't do too much on this. Then actually all of the officials around me suddenly realised they felt empowered and liberated as well. It's definitely the best thing I'm ever going to do in politics. They started to feel the same thing as well. Just the proudest thing. I'm only a bit part in this. This is all about them, not about me, but it's a bit part to release them.
Just very briefly, Camilla, why do you think it's taken an ITV drama? Bearing in mind we've all covered, this story, a drama to really sort of trigger the widespread public outrage?
Look, I mean, there has been a lot of media coverage of it. It's been a huge campaign in the Mail, all of these personal stories, but I think people have had other priorities over the last few years, COVID, the cost of living. They haven't drilled into it that much. And sometimes it just takes a drama when everyone's at home, over the Christmas and New Year period.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Some really great dramatic performances, actually, and the stark reality of it being laid bare in people's living rooms, I then think just drives it home. We've had the same effect with other campaigns, that have come to a head because suddenly it's just captured the public imagination.
Yeah. Let's talk about strikes. This headline in The Guardian: London Underground tube strike called off after positive talks with Transport for London. RMT suspends action which threatened to halt almost all tube services in the capital over the next 4 days. If you've been following it, it was literally called off at the 11th hour in a dramatic turn of events last night. The RMT union said there have been positive discussions and there is now significantly improved funding position for the ongoing talks over pay. It was after an intervention by the Mayor of London, Labour's Sadiq Khan. He said, this shows what can be achieved by engaging and working with trade unions and transport staff rather than working against them. The Telegraph has a very different take on the story. Sadiq Khan bows to unions over TfL strikes in foretaste of Labour government. 4-day walkout cancelled at the last minute after Mayor finds extra money in the budget. This is a comment from the previous Mayor of London, the Conservative Boris Johnson. He said Sadiq Khan's epic show of apathy and failure to deal with the unions, as we heard, is only a foretaste of what the nation could expect under Labour. So the question is, who's right, Francis?
Well, I find it really hard to take that, You know, we're in the midst of the longest strike in NHS modern history. With the junior doctors.
6 days, finishing tomorrow.
You know, who would have believed we'd be in a position where ministers are at war with junior doctors who were treated as heroes? Back in April last year, the BMA was calling on the government to involve ACAS, the expert body that gets resolutions, that's its job, to help it come to a fair settlement. And they haven't. The government didn't agree. So, you know, it seems to me that we need good faith negotiations. People have got to be prepared to get in the room and talk. It's very little point setting down preconditions when actually what the public wants is problems sorted out in a fair and responsible manner. I think that's what Sadiq has done.
I think both of those statements can actually be true, in so much that I totally agree in sort of open negotiations. Francis and I first met during those periods in COVID when we were talking to Paul Novak and others about working conditions and how you could open up offices and workplaces again. In terms of the detail of the Sadiq Khan's settlement, where's the £30 million come from? Why has it suddenly just come on the table at the last minute? So I need to see the detail of why that, because this is a guy that that said he was not going to have any strikes on the tube. I think it's the 170th day or something like that.
The problem here, Paul, as you know, was that the government only gave half of what was needed for capital investment and maintenance on the tube system, and that puts pressure on other budgets, other TfL budgets. So that was the problem. It was like austerity in the mayoral election year for Sadiq Khan. And Sadiq has managed to find a way through, and I think should be given credit for that, because, you know, I would much rather people were negotiating over the weekend, which is what they were doing, rather than sat in separate rooms, which is what we've got with the junior doctors.
No, but in the doctors, but the junior doctors, I mean, the health secretary has been really clear, said if you call off the strike, then they will talk. And Victoria Atkins is really keen to talk. And so that's why I mean both statements can be true.
Christmas.
Both sides need to have that goodwill as well.
Right, but which approach works better? Is it the Sadiq Khan collaborative approach, as he puts it, or is it, in Boris Johnson's words, a failure to deal with the unions and an epic show of apathy?
You don't go into battle with the unions. You don't go into battle with workers. But you know, you do have
the government's
open
been
negotiations
doing over the last few months.
No, I think it's different. When you've got
again, whether it was the nurses, whether it was consultants, whether the junior doctors. Ministers started from this position that we're not going to get round the table, you've got the deal you've got, we're not going to negotiate on it at all. And then we get strikes, they go on for several months, people suffer the consequences of that, and then eventually ministers decide, oh, we do have to get round the table. So that front page of the Telegraph with that quote from Boris Johnson saying, oh, this is a foretaste of a Labour government, made me laugh, because anyone who was worried about not being able to get to work today in London or for the next few days, relieved and think, thank goodness they were sensible, they got round the table. And anyone at home who's waiting for something like a hip operation, who is in pain, who wants to know, why is the government not sorting out these strikes, will think, maybe if that's a foretaste of a Labour government, that's what I want.
No, I agree. That's why I'm talking about the detail, because I agree with the fact that, you know, as a commuter myself, it's good to be able to travel. I came on the tube myself this morning, but that £30 million that's come in, now the other unions that have already dealt and settled, what do they think? Does it start opening other
it's
inquiries?
agenda for change.
So,
the doctors
I'm just meaning, if you have a knee-jerk reaction, that's why I don't know about the detail. If it's a knee-jerk reaction, then it's a short-term thing that may unwind. But fair negotiations and open talks.
Let me pick up on Paul's point with you, Camilla, because this is the headline in the Evening Standard. Tube strikes. ASLEF drivers, the other train drivers' union, now demand 12% pay rise after Sadiq Khan finds £30 million to avert week-long walkouts. ASLEF, which represents the majority of tube drivers, says Mayor has found the magic money tree and our members expect to share the fruit.
Yes, they'll want the magic
And why
money
not?
tree to be shaken. I think while I agree with you, John, because I, side with Relief along with a lot of my friends who are trying to contemplate how we're going to get into work this week, that the strikes have been averted. In the back of your mind, there is the sort of fear of, well, what compromises have been made, and ultimately will commuters end up paying for it in the long run anyway? And Francis, you talk about, you can't go into these negotiations sort of making arbitrary statements. I mean, in the case of the junior doctors, they've asked for 35%.
That's a starting point, Camilla. We know that's a starting point.
I know, but we still can't get out of Labour. I mean, how many times have I or you asked Wes Streeting, well, what would you settle on? No figure is given. It's perfectly legitimate.
What are Labour going to say? Just pick a random figure.
Let me just finish my point. It's perfectly legitimate for other workers who might be in two minds about any strikes, junior doctors, tube strikes, teacher strikes or whatever, worried about the inflationary effect on them of the government, or indeed Sadiq Khan or a future Labour government, constantly caving into pay demands, because that just makes the financial situation difficult for everyone.
People understand those arguments, but what they want to see is, whether it's Sadiq Khan or whether it's government ministers, they want to see them in a room with the trade unions and with the workers trying to resolve these things. I
totally agree with negotiation versus stalemate, but they also don't want to see any government, Labour or Conservative, over a barrel in hock to the unions.
No.
Is that what it is, over a barrel?
Well, like it was in the 1970s. I think people find that quite regressive, actually.
Well, I mean, more broadly, would a Labour government end up handing out fruit from the magic money tree to lots of different trade unions?
I think what people sometimes don't understand as a trade unionist is all workers are doing is defending themselves against real terms pay cuts at the moment. They're not being greedy. The doctors have actually been very clear that they're not looking for 35% now. They're looking for steps towards restoration of the pay they've lost since 2010, which is, depending on what you read, anything up to a quarter or a third of their real pay has been cut. They're looking for restoration. And I think what most people, particularly if you look at the trade union movement today, the big unions led by women, the majority of members women, this sort of macho approach of spending more time in TV studios slagging off workers who were once described as heroes, rather than coming to a sensible agreement, I think doesn't wash with the public either. People want it sorted. We know it's difficult. It's sometimes messy, but you want a resolution.
And I totally respect your position on this. And of course, because of your background and history, that will be your view. You could speak to other doctors, maybe doctors of my father's generation who worked for the NHS for 40 years, never earned anything like junior doctors in the day, didn't have a working time directive, which meant that they could cut their hours, used to put in 80, 90-hour weeks, honoured the Hippocratic Oath, think that these strikes have done more harm than good to patients, have seen waiting lists go up, not down, which may be a governmental responsibility, but also the doctors on the ground, and disagree with them. The single mother friend of mine who was saying to me yesterday, doesn't have that much money, how am I going to get into work tomorrow, doesn't earn as much as anybody, any of the average wage for some of the people striking on behalf of the RMT, if you look at the average wage, for instance, of a TfL worker or indeed a tube driver, saying to me, can you help me get in? Are you going to drive into London? Can I come with you? So that, not everybody is kind of universally in support of this sort of utopian, the workers first and the union first. Some of them think that the unions are actually, pitting some workers on better wages against workers who don't have any choice but to use the tube or be grotesquely inconvenienced.
I think one of the reasons
the RMT can seemingly hold London to ransom every 5 minutes.
One of the reasons why the public has supported workers as a last resort, not doing it lightly, who have taken strike action, is because they've seen the impact of what's happening to services. The Independent Health Foundation said that the NHS strikes account for about 3% of the increase in waiting lists. We've got 6.5 million people on those waiting lists. Doctors, nurses, frontline health workers see it every day and want to see the service.
Well, then also, they don't see it as a last resort anymore, because there seem to be workers on strike all the time.
Well, we've had wage cuts, real wage cuts.
But on the NHS and the juniors doctors strike, it's the longest in history, I think, the 6-day walkout, and it is clearly putting a lot of pressure on the NHS. Rishi Sunak says it's making it very difficult to start clearing the backlog. I mean, whose side is Keir Starmer going to be on? Is he going to be on the side, if he wins the election and becomes Prime Minister, the patients or the junior doctors?
I think politicians are there to serve the people, But if you want world-class public services, you've got to treat the people who deliver those services decently. And I think what Keir Starmer has pointed out, many have pointed out, is that there was never a national NHS strike when Labour was in power. So look at the track record, but also look at the way that you treat people. If you treat people with respect, if you have good faith negotiations, if you have decent bargaining structures, you know, Labour has promised a fair pay agreement for social care workers, which I think most people in this country agree that they should get a decent wage and conditions.
Well, I
for
think the
work
debate
they
is
do.
about what that means in terms of a pay rise. Let's just talk about climate change, because MPs are going to debate the cannily named Offshore Petroleum Licensing Bill that would see licences awarded annually for oil and gas projects in the North Sea. Now, the bill has caused some unrest amongst Conservative backbenchers, with the former Energy Minister Chris Skidmore resigning over the issue. Let's take a look also at this headline in The Guardian. Alok Sharma, who was president of COP26, saying, "I won't back UK government's oil and gas bill." Paul, what difference is this bill actually going to make to our energy security?
Well, essentially, it allows us to have the transition to net zero, use the full years to actually to be able to make sure that we can still be drilling for oil and coal rather than having to import it from other areas. So we're not going to be bringing as much oil and gas in from states which are going to have us over the barrel.
Although the new analysis from the Energy and Climate Intelligence Units found that oil from new licences sent to UK refineries would account for less than 1% of the fuels used in the UK in 2030.
Yeah, but these, as I say, this is all ultimately all about a transition. It's not going to be the majority. This is the entire.
So is it
point
actually
of
going to make any difference, this bill? I mean, Alok Sharma has said it's a smoke and mirrors bill that changes nothing.
No, I think, as I say, it allows us to still be using the oil fields whilst we are transitioning to more wind, more renewables, more nuclear. All those things that we should have been doing over the in terms of nuclear over the last 10 years or so, which was actually in the coalition years was very difficult because the Lib Dems
So you're comfortable with
were
all of
against
this?
it. Yeah.
You're right. I mean, Francis, Labour has said it wouldn't revoke new North Sea oil and gas exploration licences despite opposing them. Why not?
Because of the contracts. That's the problem, is once you've issued the contract, trying to if there's no get-out clause in the contract, and I assume there isn't, then, you know, it's incredibly expensive to do so. But what Labour is very clear on is that it's going to have clean power by 2030. That commitment is there. And I'd have more sympathy, Paul, with your argument if I knew what the government's plan for a fair transition was. I don't see anything about how do we protect livelihoods and skills in the parts of the country that are going to be affected by the transition that we do need to make towards cleaner power.
Right.
And I think what I'm interested in is actually let's come up with some industrial policy that actually plans that green transition, because we have to do it. For the climate, for green jobs, to get the investment.
But do you admit,
our competitors
well, then you're
winning
prepared to see
over our
jobs
heads.
lost in order to further that transition?
That's the point. I'm not. I want to see
Well, they will be lost up in Scotland and the North Sea.
protected, but we've got incredibly
How?
skilled people who can be moved into equally skilled work that pays as well if we have a proper plan.
But this is what's happening when you talk about the renewable industry, in particular in the North East. You look at the gigafactories that are being developed. You look at the hydrogen strategy
There's no
that we published.
industrial policy.
But
Where's the strategy?
But they are picked out by, you have the Green Deal, you've got the hydrogen strategy that pulls together at least two of those three things. You don't need to repeat it in another industrial strategy.
The UK's record on growth and investment, I'm afraid to say, is rubbish. We are languishing at the bottom of the league tables, and we need to have a real industrial strategy for prosperity, green prosperity.
Well, on decarbonisation, of course, the government would say it's done well, but we're talking about different things to some extent. Is this bill, is it politics rather than policy?
It definitely is a gimmick. The government were able to hand out these licences as it is. Anyway. So it's a gimmick. The government are overreacting to that by-election, that long night we spent here when it was the Uxbridge and South Ruislip by-election, and the Tories managed to cling on by 500 votes. And suddenly the government think, oh, well, that means the whole country don't care about the environment anymore. And I think that is a miscalculation. And one of the impacts that this bill does have, and one of the things that Alok Sharma, who was COP president, has been talking about, is how the one impact it does have is destroying our reputation on the world stage. And we all know that the UK is not going to be able to solve climate change by itself. We've got to persuade other countries to come with us on that journey. And the UK was able to do that when it had that leadership role on the world stage. And now it's just chucked that reputation out of the window just for the sake of a few votes that it thinks it might win that it probably won't win. And then we're just stuck in this position where it's difficult for us to persuade other countries to take action when they just look at what we're doing back here.
Right, it's politics then, not really serious
Some
policy.
of it's politics. I mean, I think one of the reasons we have to admit why Keir Starmer had to flip-flop on his oil and gas licences is because he came under pressure from the unions. And quite rightly, they were worried about job losses, although I take your point, Francis, about the lack of innovation in trying to convert people who might be working on oil and gas onto greener technologies. I think from the public's perspective, they found the 2030 target sort of scarily arbitrary anyway with regard to ditching their petrol and diesels, etc., etc. That was compounded.
So we go for an arbitrary target of 2035
but
instead,
I think
just as arbitrary.
I think what's happened is as well since 2020 and everything that then happened following on from that pledge and people facing a cost of living crisis, it seemed premature to then put them under the added cost pressure of making some of these changes. Also, I think the public are fairly sanguine about the notion of actually us needing fossil fuels for some time to come. Of course, there's support, I think, for innovation of nuclear and other technologies. But I think people think that some aspects of the more extreme end of the green lobby wedge, saying that we can just dispense with fossil fuels and it won't have a fundamental effect on all of us.
Well, let me just point, Francis, to the headline in The Times, because we've discussed it endlessly. Labour prepares to scale back flagship £28 billion green pledge. You look sceptical there. Maybe you don't recognise this, perhaps withdrawing, preparing to significantly scale back that pledge. Now, we found out before Christmas that, yes, they're still committed to spending it, but by the second half of next Parliament. They're not going to do it in the first few years. But now, Keir Starmer, talking to LBC on Friday, said the £28 billion plan is subject to our fiscal rules. It's our ambition. So saving the world will come second to balancing the books.
I'm sorry to the Times, but that is not a new story. I think Labour's always been saying that it's going to stick to its fiscal rules, that we didn't, you know, that announcement about the 28 billion was made before the Liz Truss, you know, disastrous budget that crushed the economy, that we will have to look at the books when we come into power. But we were absolutely committed to clean power by 2030, including by setting up Great British Energy.
But might you not invest as much as £28 billion a year, even by the second half of the next Parliament?
Oh, I think Keir's been pretty clear that it's going to be ramped up and ramped up. In the meantime, what Labour's doing is talking to those global green investors about getting the planning reform in place, the supply chains ready, and the skilled workers.
Well,
you know, we don't invest enough in skills in this country, half as much as Europe on average. And so we've got to get the plan in place to really make sure that
what's going on here, Don? It sounds to me that every week that goes by, there is a change, maybe rightly or wrongly, to this plan until Labour, if they win the election, see the books. Is that still going to happen next Parliament, £28 billion green pledge?
Well, I think that the reason that you've heard different kind of ways that it's been talked about is because the Tories have seen this as a way they can attack the Labour Party, and you've heard all those concerns about the 28 billion. I think what actually you heard from Keir Starmer yesterday morning, he was out on Sky in the morning, he was quite firm in defending this and was saying, if you want an argument at the election about whether we should borrow to invest in the future, then I'm happy to have that argument. I think that's a much better position for Labour to be in than rather having these constant discussions about when exactly you'd get the money and how exactly it would go up. I think that if Labour Party are going to have this policy, they need to go out there and defend it and sell it to people.
Right. I mean, if they do decide Labour to go really hard in on the green commitment, they are going to be ahead of the Conservatives. I mean, Chris Skidmore is right. International reputation in terms of the licences on oil and gas is just going to make it look...
If you're borrowing 28 billion quid to put into these net zero targets, then all you're actually doing is you're front-loading the cost to ordinary taxpayers of a lot of this. Where the transition that I was talking about earlier is going to come from is greater use of tech and innovation, which is going to drive down the costs over that period of time. I would agree with John that you talk about an arbitrary 2030. He's brought it in line with Europe, but I wouldn't have made that decision now. I think we'd had another few years.
That's all we have time for. Curtain raiser for 2024. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 when we'll be asking how to tackle school absences, which have soared since COVID. From all of us here, bye-bye.